Hi, this week we're looking at deviance and crime. Deviance is an action which deviates from the norm. Is deviance always a bad thing? Not necessarily. Let us go back in time. At a time in the United States when the United States was most racially divided, to the point where getting on a bus, blacks could not sit on the front of the bus, they had to sit at the back of the bus. And yet, here it is one day, this lady, after a long, hard day's work, on her way home, she boarded a bus, and as she boarded a bus, sat in one of the first seats that she found. And when they approached her and said, "You can't sit here," her response was, "I am tired and I just have to sit down." This person was Rosa Parks. Thanks to Rosa Parks, this was a defining moment in the history of the civil rights movement. Having said that, when we think about deviance, the nature of deviance is affected by situations. For example, gender. There are things that are okay for males to do, but not okay for females. It's okay for males to have multiple partners, but we frown upon females who have multiple partners. It's okay for someone to date their gardener, but not their therapist. It is okay for a 21-year-old to have sex, but not a 70-year-old. And so we see that there's some things that, depending on the situation, is okay to be done. And then in another situation, it is not okay. As we look at deviance, we're going to start off by taking a look at the purpose of deviance. In other words, what role does deviance serve in society? Then we're going to take a look at theories that try to explain deviant behavior. According to Karl Marx, deviance serves a purpose in society in that it separates the haves from the have-nots. We know the ruling class determines moral norms. As a matter of fact, according to Marx, the law is a reflection of the interests of the ruling class, who have power over economic and political processes. Then we have Emil Durkheim, who argues that deviant is a necessary factor in society, as had it not been for the criminal, we wouldn't need prisons. No prisons, no jobs. So, according to Durkheim, then, deviance provides for society things that without deviance we would not have otherwise had. Now, in looking at theories that try to explain deviance, one of the first theories that I want to bring your attention to is a theory by Edwin Lemert. Edwin Lemert argues that deviance is a matter of labeling. So he breaks it down into primary and secondary deviance. Under primary deviance, the person commits an act and the act goes unpunished. And at that point, the person is not really deviant. However, the moment the act gets punished, the person gets incarcerated, that is where you have the developing of deviance. Why? Because at that point, the person goes before a judge. The case is adjudicated. The person is guilty. The person goes to jail. So someone in jail asked, "What are you here for?" And they said, "Well, I'm a thief." So before, if you ask this person, "Are you a thief?" they would say, "I'm not a thief." But the moment the courts adjudicates them thief, that is a label that they wear, perhaps for the rest of their lives. So, according to Limmer, then, the behavior does not become deviant until it is labeled deviant. Now we move on to theories that could be considered controversial. The biological theory. And looking at biological theory, we're going to look at a couple of biological theories. The first one we're going to look at is the theory postulated by Cecile Lombroso called the theory of atavism. In the theory of atavism, Lombroso argues that the criminal has character traits which predisposes him to criminal behavior. These character traits are tied to that of primitive man. So when you think of primitive man, there are certain things that come to mind: physical, emotional, mental, that comes to mind when you think of primitive man. And he says if you take a look at the criminal, they have these same character traits. So the criminal doesn't have to have all of the character traits, but a preponderance of them, and that predisposes them to criminal behavior. So he looks at things such as he looks at what he calls physical anomalies. And physical anomalies are where the person has physical traits. And he says when you take a look at these physical traits, they are akin to primitive man. A large head, large cranial, face of disproportionate size, large eyes, small ears. He said when you take a look at this person, there's something off with this person that predisposes them to criminal behavior. Then he looks at something he calls sensory and functional peculiarities. Here he looks at general sensibility, sensibility to pain, tactile sensibility, meteoric sensibility, agility, and strength. In looking at these items, he's saying, hey, look, the criminal has sensitivities that the non-criminal doesn't have. Or he's more sensitized in certain areas that you wouldn't necessarily find in the non-criminal. He looks at the psychology of the criminal, and in looking at the psychology of the criminal, he says your criminal tends to be more vain than the average person, more impulsive, more revengeful. They're extremely fond of animals and strangers. He looks at moral senses. And in looking at moral senses, he argues that what differentiates man from beast is the existence of a conscience. But the criminal, he argues, does not have a conscience. So he's just like an animal. He looks at criminality in children and argues that children are born atavistic by nature. So you're thinking to yourself, not quite so, not quite so. But when you think of children, you think of a child 4 or 5 years old running as mom or dad. You say to that child, don't run because you're going to fall. Why? Because by the law of physics, the child's head is the single largest organ on the body. And so if the child is running and the head goes first, what's going to happen? They're going to fall. What did Lombroso said? He said the criminal has an abnormally large head. And he was looking to this in proportion to the rest of the body. Children tend not to have a sense of right or wrong until later on in their development. So you're holding a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old pulls on your hair, and you, ouch, that hurts. What do? They laugh. And they pull again because they can't differentiate that you're hurting. I am hurting you. So when you look at some behaviors of children, they seem akin to what Lombroso described. Reality is, though, according to Lombroso, that the child grows out of this behavior. And as the child grows out of this behavior, then the child becomes, quote unquote, a normal average citizen. We have other biological theories, such as the twin studies, and this was a study done by Carl Christensen in Denmark, where he looked at 3,586 sets of twins born between 1881 and 1910, and he argues that twins who are identical in nature, if one twin is a criminal, the other is more likely to be one as well. As opposed to twins who are fraternal in nature, they're not as likely to be a criminal if one is. So in other words, he argues that the identical twins are more likely to follow the path of their identical twin as opposed to fraternal twin. We look at adoption studies done mostly done between 1924 to 1947, and adoption studies argue that, look, because criminality lies in the genes, it doesn't matter who adopts who. If your parents are criminals, then more than likely you may be a criminal as well. If your parents are not criminals and you're adopted by criminals, then that doesn't really matter because it's in the genes. And finally, we have the chromosome studies where some males were found with an extra Y chromosomes. And for those males found with the extra Y chromosome, they tend to be more aggressive, taller than average. And these males are more likely to be criminals. And that is the essence of biological theories. Now bear in mind, as we talk about biological theories, they all have one thing in common. What is that one thing that they have in common? That there's something physiologically wrong with the individual that predisposes them to criminal behavior. Then we have the theory of differential association by Edwin Sutherland. And Sutherland argues that criminal behavior is learned behavior. And not only is criminal behavior learned behavior, but it is learned via interaction, via intimacy, or interaction in small groups. One learns the technique, the rationale, in other words, the how to and the why to. And he argues that differential association vary. Concept of birds of a feather flock together. Show me a company and I'll tell you who you are. So in other words, the friends that we hang out with determine who we are. He argues that groups differ. You have pro-social groups and anti-social groups. Association varies based on things such as frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. How long did you know this person or this group? How often was your interaction with this group? How close are you to this group? Do you have close bonds with them? And he wraps up by saying that criminality is not explained by a need, as we all have needs, yet we all do not resort to criminal behavior. Finally, we have Travis Hershey. Travis Hershey argues that, in the social control theory, that a young person needs to be attached to parents, teacher, or school. They need to be committed to an education, to long-term goals, to postponing adult activities. They need to be involved in after-school activities and studying and doing chores, because after all, the devil find work for idle hands. And finally, they need to believe in the law. Of all the theories that we've looked at in this class, Hershey was the only one that actually went back and tested his theory. When he tested his theory, he found everything to be the same, with the exception of belief, he found that the person doesn't initially believe in the law, but rather they get in trouble with the law, and it's at that point that they believe in the law. So you think that every night, every Friday night, you go to the bar, you drink, you get in your car, you drive, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the day you get pulled over, charged with a DUI, get sent to jail, your car gets taken, you have to pay a fine, that's when it registers to you that, hey, look, I cannot drink and drive. It is wrong. When we talk about deviance and crime, there is conventional crime, white-collar crime, organized crime, and victimless crime. Conventional crime involves crimes against property or against persons. White-collar crime is conducted within the confines of employment and white-collar employment. Organized crime, as the term suggests, is organized. It's run the same way as a legitimate business, except it is an illegitimate business. And victimless crime, the word victimless is a misnomer here, because you think victimless and you think there's no victim. Rather, the misnomer becomes where the person doesn't report the crime, either because they're a part of the crime. So I'm a drug dealer, you steal my drugs, am I going to go to the police and say, hey, look, I was robbed? No. Or the person is ashamed of the crime. I am a prostitute and I get robbed by a John. I'm not going to go to the cops and say, hey, look, I was robbed by a John. No. So these are victimless crime that goes unreported for these reasons. Having said that, we've come to the end of Deviance and Crime. Thank you very much.